He won the Nobel Prize for Literature, then refused a knighthood. This is the story of Australia's most brilliant, misunderstood literary genius, Patrick White. Patrick White stands as a monumental figure in the canon of Australian literature, a writer of immense psychological insight, poetic depth, and spiritual yearning. White gave voice to the silences of the Australian continent and the complexities of the human soul. As the first and only Australian to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature, his influence transcended national borders, reshaping the identity of modern Australian literature and culture. Behind his fierce intellect and sometimes caustic persona was a deeply spiritual and compassionate man who spent his life wrestling with questions of existence, belonging, and transcendence. This is the story of Patrick Victor Martindale White. Patrick White was born on May 28, 1912 in Knightsbridge, London, to Victor Martindale White and Ruth Withycombe, members of a prosperous Australian grazing family. Though born in England, White was of Anglo-Australian heritage, and his earliest years were a mixture of privilege and solitude. The Whites were part of the squattocracy, wealthy landowners who had established themselves in rural Australia during the colonial era. His father was reserved and emotionally distant, while his mother was cultured but concerned with social appearances. As an infant, White was diagnosed with asthma, a condition that would afflict him for most of his life. This illness led to overprotection and social isolation, planting the seeds for the introspective, sensitive personality that would define his literary voice. The family returned to Sydney when Patrick was still a toddler, and he spent much of his childhood at the family estate at Bolaro, near Adaminaby in the Snowy Mountains. The wide, barren landscapes of rural New South Wales left a profound imprint on him, providing the symbolic terrain for many of his novels. Despite his privileged upbringing, White struggled with feelings of alienation. As a child, he was introverted and drawn to the arts, in contrast to the masculine norms of rural Australia. These early tensions between societal expectations and inner truth would become central themes in his work. Patrick White's education was transcontinental. At the age of 10, he was sent to Tudor House School, a preparatory boarding school in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales. Though picturesque, the school emphasised physicality and conformity, traits that clashed with White's temperament. He later reflected bitterly on the emotional suppression and bullying he endured there. At age 13, he was sent to Cheltenham College in England. The culture shock was immense. Although White excelled in languages and literature, he was again subjected to the cruelty of institutional life. His homosexuality, though not yet consciously accepted, added another layer of alienation. He felt like an outsider in a world that rejected sensitivity and introspection. In 1932, White enrolled at King's College, Cambridge, where he studied modern languages, focusing on French and German literature. Cambridge was a turning point. Here, he encountered a more tolerant, intellectually vibrant environment. He was introduced to symbolism, surrealism, and modernist literature, elements that would shape his literary aesthetic. He read Rilke, Guide, Dostoevsky, Proust, and Woolf, immersing himself in the inner life of the human psyche. It was also during his time at Cambridge that White began writing seriously. He published poems in student journals and completed his first plays and drafts of novels. His exposure to European art and philosophy deepened his belief in literature as a vehicle for spiritual and psychological exploration. After graduating in 1935, White spent time in Germany, studying theatre at the University of Munich. He witnessed firsthand the rise of Nazism, an experience that instilled in him a deep distrust of authoritarianism and a lifelong disdain for mass ideology. It was during this period that he completed his first novel, Happy Valley, 1939, which won the Australian Literature Society Gold Medal. Although he later disavowed it, Happy Valley showcased his early experimentation with stream of consciousness, psychological depth, and the rhythms of Australian speech. Returning to Australia in the late 1930s, White attempted to find a place in the local literary scene, but found it parochial and anti-intellectual. His homosexuality, unconventional views, and literary style alienated him from the conservative culture of Sydney at the time. He felt more at home among artists, actors, and émigrés, outsiders who shared his passion for art and his disdain for bourgeois values. When World War II broke out, White enlisted in the Royal Air Force, RAF, serving as an intelligence officer in Egypt, Greece, and Palestine. The war deepened his understanding of human suffering and futility. He encountered trauma, displacement, and the absurdity of organized violence, realities that would saturate his post-war fiction. More importantly, during his time in the Middle East, White met Manoli Laskaris, a Greek army officer who would become his lifelong partner. Their relationship, though discreet, was central to White's emotional and creative life. After the war, the couple settled on a small farm in Castle Hill, on the outskirts of Sydney. There, they lived a semi-rural existence, raising dogs and growing vegetables. It was in this environment of solitude and domesticity that White produced his most celebrated novels. White's international breakthrough came with the publication of The Tree of Man in 1955, a monumental novel chronicling the life of a rural Australian couple, from pioneering hardship to suburban disillusionment. Drawing on his family's pastoralist heritage, White depicted the spiritual transformation of ordinary people. The novel was praised in America and Europe, particularly by William Faulkner and T.S. Eliot, but received mixed reviews in Australia, where critics found his style too dense and European. In 1957, White released Voss, a masterpiece inspired by the explorer Ludwig Leichhardt. In Voss, White constructed a mythic narrative of ambition, madness, and transcendence, blending historical realism with metaphysical symbolism. The novel follows the German explorer Voss as he ventures into the Australian interior, mirroring a descent into the human soul. It won the Miles Franklin Award and confirmed White's place among the greatest novelists of his time. Over the next 2 decades, Patrick White continued to produce ambitious and deeply original novels. Riders in the Chariot in 1961 presented 4 spiritual visionaries, ostracized by a society obsessed with materialism. White fused Christian mysticism with suburban Australia in a critique of conformity. The Solid Mandala in 1966 offered a psychological portrait of twin brothers, representing intellect and intuition, order and chaos. The Vivisector in 1970 was a searing depiction of an artist's life, often read as a self-portrait. The Eye of the Storm in 1973 focused on a dying matriarch, and the disintegration of familial bonds, echoing Shakespearean themes of power and mortality. White's prose became increasingly dense, poetic, and philosophical. He experimented with narrative structure, interior monologue, and symbolic motifs. His characters were often misfits, visionaries, and sufferers, individuals torn between the demands of the world and their inner calling. In 1973, White was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, the first and only Australian to receive this distinction. The Swedish Academy praised him for an epic and psychological narrative art, which has introduced a new continent into literature. Despite the honour, White declined to attend the ceremony, citing poor health. In truth, he detested public spectacle and distrusted institutions of power. The award ignited a national debate. While many celebrated his global recognition, others viewed him as elitist and out of touch. White used the prize money to establish the Patrick White Award, which he gave annually to under-recognised Australian writers, a testament to his commitment to nurturing national literature. In addition to novels, White wrote plays such as The Season at Sarsaparilla, Night on Bald Mountain, and Big Toys, though his success in theatre was limited. Australian audiences found his dramatic work too abstract, and White often clashed with directors and critics. Politically, White became increasingly outspoken. He criticised the Vietnam War, the monarchy, environmental destruction, and government indifference toward Aboriginal Australians. In 1976, he refused a knighthood and the Order of Australia, denouncing the country's conservative drift. A committed secular humanist, White was also a mystic. Drawn to Christian symbolism, Eastern philosophy, and Jungian psychology, his spirituality was non-doctrinal but deeply felt, a quest for unity beyond duality. In the 1980s, White published his autobiography, Flaws in the Glass, in 1981, offering candid reflections on his childhood, sexuality, politics, and writing. It was both a confession and a reckoning. a window into his inner life and grievances with Australia's literary and cultural institutions. His final novel, Memoirs of Many in One, in 1986, was published under the pseudonym Alex Xenophon Demirjian Gray, playing with identity, authorship, and metafiction. Though not as widely read as earlier works, it demonstrated his continued innovation and wit. By the late 1980s, White's health had deteriorated. He suffered from lung problems, arthritis, and declining eyesight. He died on September 30th, 1990, at the age of 78. Per his wishes, there was no funeral, no public ceremony, only quiet remembrance. Patrick White's legacy is towering. He redefined what Australian literature could be: psychologically rich, philosophically daring, and spiritually ambitious. His influence extends beyond literature into film, visual art, theatre, and cultural criticism. Though his style remains challenging, his vision of Australia as a place of metaphysical significance continues to inspire. Writers such as David Malouf, Helen Garner, Christos Tsiolkas, and Tim Winton have cited his influence. His work is taught in universities worldwide and continues to provoke debate, analysis, and admiration. White once wrote, "I'm more concerned with the soul than the surface." In an age dominated by spectacle and noise, his novels remind us of the quiet, painful, and often miraculous journey of being human. Honours and commemorations: Nobel Prize in Literature, 1973, multiple Miles Franklin Awards and Australian Literature Society, Gold Medal, founding of the Patrick White Award, 1974, subject of major biographies, plays, and documentaries, extensive Patrick White archive at the National Library of Australia, portraits by Sidney Nolan, Brett Whiteley, and Fred Williams. Patrick White remains Australia's most complex and revered literary figure. A man of contradictions, spiritual yet sceptical, private yet political, solitary yet generous, he lived a life committed to truth and artistic integrity. Through his novels, he challenged a nation to confront its soul, and in doing so became one of the great prophets of modern literature. If you want more untold stories of brilliant Australians who shaped history and defied the odds, hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to uncover.